Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker and I'm joined by Ash Sarkar. Ash, how are you doing? Have you got that Christmassy feeling?
I do feel a bit Christmassy in that I've got that kind of sore throat, which is like threatening to take over, but hasn't quite. I also feel, we were discussing this before we went live. I feel that Gary has made me massive on the screen. I look like the Statue of Liberty, just a ginormous woman, Gary. What's happening?
An epic and welcoming lady. So fantastic. Coming up on tonight's show, Joe Biden pardons his son, Hunter. You would, wouldn't you? What happened in the Irish elections, and Gregg Wallace complains about middle-class women of a certain age. On the day that Israel and Hezbollah agreed a ceasefire in Lebanon last week, opposition fighters in Syria launched a surprise offensive into government-controlled areas in the northwest of the country. The focus at first was Syria's second largest city, Aleppo, forcing the government-controlled Syrian military to redeploy in the biggest threat to the country's president, Bashar al-Assad, in years. That redeployment failed, and by Friday, opposition forces had taken the city, celebrating with fireworks and gunfire while destroying images of Assad. A day later, the opposition forces took control of Assad's official residence in Aleppo, though the president wasn't there at the time. And in the city's centre, fighters also tore down a statue of Assad's deceased brother, Bashar al-Assad, to the sounds of gunfire. The withdrawal of the Syrian military came with other benefits to the militants beyond the symbolic. Opposition fighters appear to have added to their armories tanks and other armoured vehicles abandoned by government soldiers. The taking of Aleppo is a significant victory for the opposition forces. Since 2016, the city has been under Assad's control after a brutal air assault by Russia helped the Syrian government retake it from rebel groups. And as it did in 2016, Russia appears to be helping Assad to regain that ground now. On Sunday, several large explosions struck the entrance to the Aleppo University Hospital, and according to humanitarian organization the Syrian White Helmets, they were caused by Russian and Syrian warplanes, killing 12 people. Now, Aleppo doesn't appear to be the opposition forces' only target. Militants have begun moving south from Aleppo, taking control of stretches of an arterial road leading directly to the capital, Damascus. They've also been pushing further east into Aleppo province. So who is the group behind this fresh anti-Assad push? Well, they seem to be an assortment of fighters from various countries across the Middle East and Central Asia, and many from Syria. But they're led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, also known as HTS, formerly known as al-Nusra. Their founder is Abu Muhammad al-Jalani, a former al-Qaeda fighter in Iraq, who also worked with Islamic State before splitting with both. Before 2016, al-Nusra was a Salafi jihadist force driven by a literalist interpretation of Islam and inflicting violence and death on Muslim and non-Muslim opponents alike. Since then, the rebranded HTS has attempted to occupy a more moderate position with a focus on establishing Islamic rule in Syria, stopping the Assad regime and removing Iranian militias. Now, just how deep that rebrand really goes is an open question. Now, as for its external support, HTS is reportedly receiving military and financial aid from Turkey, which puts it at odds with other forces in Syria. This map shows who has controlled which areas since 2020. So in the northeast, HTS, shown in green, controlled much of Idlib province, and in the past 5 days, they doubled that area. Meanwhile, in the north and northwest, the yellow areas you can see are controlled by the Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF. That's the Kurdish-led coalition that aims for a secular and democratic Syria. Next, you can see the blue areas in the north. They're occupied by the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army. And finally, the red area is controlled by the Assad government and the Syrian military. Of course, after 14 years of civil war, the political and military map of Syria is extraordinarily complicated. And to get a grip on the groups involved in the events of the past 5 days, I spoke earlier to Danny Ellis. Danny served as an internationalist volunteer in Kurdish-controlled Rojava in northeast Syria for 5 years, up until 2023, when she returned to the UK. Now, I began by asking her to talk about the group who have recently retaken Aleppo, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham.
Hayat Tahrir al-Sham are this faction based in northwest Syria that have just taken over much of Aleppo. They've doubled the size of their territorial holdings in northwest Syria. They're the people that are being referred to as the rebels, the Syrian rebels. They claim to trace their lineage back to the original Free Syrian Army, who first took on Assad in the Arab Spring. They are not part of that group anymore. They're not. There's not a direct lineage. They are an amalgamation of a number of groups, including what used to be known as Al Qaeda in Syria, or Al Qaeda in the Levant, Jabhat al-Nusra, and various other pretty hardline Islamist organizations that have now been reorganized and rebranded by quite a savvy actor called Jolani, who's their main leader. And they're the ones who've been responsible for most of the gains in the last week.
And I suppose, who they are, I suppose, matters to how people view what's happening, because obviously sort of in the moment of the Arab Spring, people were saying Assad, terrible dictator, this rebellion is presumably just. The more recent thing in people's memories is ISIS taking over large parts of Syria. Which of those lenses do you think it's more sensible to look at what's going on through or what's happening right now?
The Syrian civil war has been on for so long and it's so complicated and so messy. It's hard to kind of condense what's happened into one perspective or outlook. Obviously, I'm coming from a Kurdish outlook. I spent 5 years in the Kurdish northeastern part of Syria. From that viewpoint, it looks like one group, the Assad state, who spent decades oppressing the Kurds, is being swapped out for a much more ISIS-like Islamist faction, who have rebranded and definitely quite effectively rebranded themselves, and they're saying things like, we're going to treat the people in the newly liberated lands equally, we're not going to tear down Christmas trees, this kind of thing. Are clearly, there are guys who are taking part in this operation who still have their original ISIS patches on their uniform, who are some pretty hardline Islamists, and it certainly seems like, certainly for the Kurds, or for the people who really just want to get on with their lives in and around Aleppo, it's kind of out of the frying pan into the fire.
And I have to admit, sort of from my perspective, I had assumed, I suppose, that Assad had basically won the Syrian civil war. That sort of international organizations, the Arab League, for example, for that reason, were trying to normalize relations, and people were almost, moving on. Obviously, not a happy ending to the story, but it seemed as if, to me, that the Syrian civil war was something that we could talk about more in the past tense. Was I just completely mistaken, or was it kind of over and now it's at risk of beginning again?
No, that was a widely held view. Much of the world, I think, much of the Middle East and international powers were starting to take that view. There were definitely steps towards the renormalization of Assad. They were being re-entered into a Middle Eastern politics, into the Arab League. Trade was starting to open again, and there was this general feeling that we were looking at a long-term post-war semi-partition of Syria, but whether the Assad state was going to be the dominant force, and probably eventually this northwestern Idlib enclave, which is where HTS are based, and Rojava would probably end up being subsumed into that. That was the general prevailing outlook. You're definitely not alone in that view.
And what changed then? I mean, a lot of people have been focusing on geopolitics, the idea that Assad's two main allies, Russia and Iran, have been distracted. So Russia, of course, in Ukraine, and Iran with Israel. Is that basically it? Was sort of Assad weak because his allies were distracted, and so opposition forces saw a chance to pounce, as it were?
Yeah, I would go further and say distracted, though. He was heavily propped up by both Hezbollah and Russia. Say Iran, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, and Hezbollah as one axis, and Russia as the complement, particularly with air power. It's the general view as I understood it, was that they were sort of a trifecta. They were equal parties in this. They were part of this sort of axis of resistance, along with other groups outside that, like Hamas. And I think his army has very much been shown to be a lot weaker, the weaker party of that three-way alliance. Russia and Iran, Hezbollah, were genuinely very powerful actors, but have been so attrited, and in particular with Hezbollah, had been decapitated pretty much by Israel, that there wasn't really much left of any of them. And in particular, the Russian air power, which is what they relied on very heavily to take back Aleppo over 4 years, up until 2015-16, has got to the point where they can't carry out the sort of mass carpet bombing, collective punishment that they used to, which they heavily relied on, and they can't target these individual sort of guerrilla units of HTS that are moving rapidly through the Assadist lines.
And in terms of alliances on the other side, my understanding is that sort of Turkey is the biggest player there. And to me, that seems very risky, right? I mean, obviously the Syrian civil war was quite destabilizing for Turkey in the sense that you had a massive refugee crisis. If they're sort of backing forces seeking to reopen this conflict, could that not massively backfire for the Turkish government?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly could. They have to look at how they can manipulate or how they can aid groups operating in Syria to best suit their geopolitical desire and outlook. And the two things that can seem to concern them the most, that they've been most open about, are they don't want a Kurdish statelet state, however you want to describe it. They don't want a self-determined Kurdish administration on their doorstep. And they see that as an existential threat to Turkey. Because Turkey is ultimately an ethno-nationalist state, and you can't have separate identities from that. And B, they have a vast refugee population. I mean, millions and millions, I think. I don't know the numbers exactly, but it's like a significant portion of the Turkish population are Syrian refugees. And so if they can, if territory in northern Syria can, A, subdue the Kurds or eliminate them, and B, provide space to send refugees back, that suits their aims. And I don't think that the Turkish don't have a particularly good long-term outlook. I think this is quite a short-term need for them. I don't think that they triggered this or even necessarily gave it their blessing, because HTS isn't the main group that they're backing in the northwest. But I definitely think they're going to take advantage of this.
And does the West have any skin in the game in what's going on here? I mean, I doubt there are many people in Western capitals sort of celebrating this reopening. Lots of people saying that maybe Israel won't mind Assad being weakened to some degree. I mean, how should people interpret what might be going on there?
I mean, there's no doubt about this. This is a catastrophe, I think. The people who are liberating, as they call it, Aleppo, are really unpleasant guys. They're certainly going to be. There already are huge numbers of internally displaced people heading towards Rojava, the Kurdish area in the northeast. I think by the current account, around 300,000. Syria has obviously been the main source of refugees attempting to get to Europe. It was a big driver of the migrant crisis, the European migrant crisis. And as a result, I think that's probably only going to get worse. A lot of people will be trying to get back in and to resettle in Syria. A lot will be forcibly resettled in Syria. I think a lot of people are going to be trying to get out as well. And at the same time, we're seeing the rise of the far right in Europe and more heavy border controls going up, a much more difficult environment for refugees. Honestly, I think there's like a serious brewing catastrophe here.
And obviously it's Rojava, which you're sort of most informed about, where you have the most connections. How will people in that region be responding to this or preparing to this? Are there going to be sort of military units preparing to take on HTS, or what do you see sort of going on there?
there seems to have been sort of an uneasy gentleman's agreement, something like that, between the Kurdish forces and HTS to not attack each other in Aleppo and the surrounding area. They both, I mean, this is where it gets very messy, because it's not just three factions. There's in fact, within the rebel faction, there are two main groups, and the other one is the SNA, who are responsible for a lot of the worst war crimes and incursions into Kurdish territory. I think this is a big shock. I think this is going to be a huge shock, because it means for the Kurds and for Rojava giving up the idea of ever liberating Afrin, certainly in the short to medium term. Afrin was a Kurdish majority city in the far northwest of Syria, which mostly escaped the Syrian civil war until 2018, when it was invaded and occupied by the SNA with Turkey's backing, and has been almost completely depopulated of Kurds. It's been completely ethnically cleansed. So the idea of giving up ever liberating Afrin and the surrounding areas is a huge blow to morale for people in the northeast.
And finally, because you mentioned earlier, sort of Turkey having, one of their aims is they don't want a Kurdish state on their border. The other is they want to return refugees. I remember Afrin speaking on this show sort of about the attack on that city by Turkish-backed forces and the ethnic cleansing, I suppose, of the Kurdish residents there. Did that lead to the Turkish government managing to sort of expel or move, I don't know what language we're using, but sort of move refugees in Turkey back into Afrin? Was that something that would have been seen as a success by the Turkish government? Did they sort of manage to achieve that?
Yeah, I mean, I take issue with the use of the word back. The people that were moved into Afrin were mostly the families of the fighters who expelled the Kurdish people from that area. It was a sort of semi-managed demographic change. So there have been settlements built. There's even been some settlements built there with Palestinian money, just to make things even more complicated and messy. And I think Turkey have seen it as the first step towards the success of resettling the refugee population into Syria. And they want to repeat it. But it definitely hasn't been enough for them.
This is clearly, a very fast-moving situation. I mean, very difficult for anyone to follow, really. What should people be looking out for? What do you see happening next? I suppose, the worst-case scenario is that this sort of grows into a civil war as bloody and violent as we've seen sort of at the height of conflict over the past years. Where do you see this going?
I mean, I think right now it's moving so fast that just in the time we've been on air, things will have shifted. Lines will have shifted. Towns would have been captured and fallen and been liberated, however you want to put it. A week ago, no one had any idea this was so close to happening. Certainly no one outside of HS's leadership. So right now, it's really hard to predict. The important things to get out there, it's not getting it into the news. I think partially because it's just such a hard narrative. It's so hard to extract a narrative, a singular, comprehensible narrative from this incredibly messy and long-running conflict. So paying attention to spreading the words and keeping informed is really important.
Hunter Biden is the youngest and only surviving son of US President Joe Biden, and over the years, he's created more than a few embarrassing headlines for his father. These included the leak of thousands of photographs from Hunter's laptop showing him in several compromising positions, and one of them involved this footage of Biden apparently weighing out crack cocaine, a drug he was alleged to use every 20 minutes. Is that 21 grams of crack cocaine? That seems like quite a lot, doesn't it? I suppose if you're taking it every 20 minutes, allegedly, that would make sense. That wasn't the end of Hunter's troubles, though. In June this year, Hunter's lifestyle caught up with him when he was convicted of 3 felonies for lying about his drug use when buying a gun in 2018. And for those crimes, Hunter faced a maximum of 25 years in jail. There was a first-time offender. There was a good chance he wouldn't serve any time at all. Then, though, things got worse. In September, Hunter was convicted on a further 3 felony tax offences in a Los Angeles court, as well as 6 tax misdemeanours. Sentencing for those crimes was due to take place in exactly 2 weeks' time. But now, in one of his last acts in office, Joe Biden has guaranteed Hunter will never face justice.
We're coming on the air with breaking news, first reported by NBC News. President Biden has pardoned his son, Hunter, ahead of the end of his presidential term.
Now, Biden's pardon doesn't just concern Hunter's gun and tax convictions, but stretches over a full decade, making Hunter immune to prosecution for any crimes, any possible crimes he may have committed between January 2014 and December 2024. Now, it is in fact the most wide-reaching presidential pardon in decades, comparable only to the blanket pardon President Gerald Ford gave his predecessor, Richard Nixon, in 1974. Now, laying out his reasons for the sweeping immunity, Joe Biden said this: "No reasonable person who looks at the facts of Hunter's case can reach any other conclusion than Hunter was singled out only because he is my son, and that is wrong. I believe in the justice system, but as I have wrestled with this, I also believe raw politics has infected this process, and it led to a miscarriage of justice. And once I made this decision this weekend, there was no sense in delaying it further. I hope Americans will understand why a father and a president would come to this decision." Now, Biden wasn't clear what the miscarriage of justice he's referring to was. I suppose he's saying he was politically persecuted, nor how it took place in 2 different judicial jurisdictions across a total of 12 different offences. But what is clear is that Biden has broken a promise, one the White House made several times.
Will you accept the jury's outcome, their verdict, no matter what it is?
Yes.
And have you ruled out a pardon for your son?
Yes. I'm extremely proud of my son, Hunter. He has overcome an addiction. He's one of the brightest, most decent men I know. And I am satisfied that I'm not going to do anything. I said I'd abide by the jury decision, and I will do that, and I will not pardon him.
It's still a no. It will be a no. It is a no, and I don't have anything else to add. Will he pardon his son? No.
Is there any possibility that the president would end up pardoning his son?
No.
They weren't ambiguous, actually. There was none of this seems like political persecution, so we're going to keep our options open. They just said simply, no, out of the question, not going to happen. And in terms of fallout, Biden's U-turn has left a number of liberal commentators with egg on their face.
Major commitment from the president, accepting the outcome of the trial and also pledging not to pardon his son.
So the challenge for him is really to continue to live up to his values when it was really personal, and he did that today.
It seems like a pretty normal, straightforward answer, but it takes new weight when we see what Trump is saying about the outcome of his trial, what we're hearing from other Republicans who say they don't accept the jury's verdict here in New York.
The contrast is profound. To sit there and say, well, I'm not going to intervene in the legal process, and I wouldn't pardon my son. One side, Democrats and Joe Biden protecting the justice system. And on the other, Republicans and Trump protecting Trump.
Our current president of the United States has so much respect for the law that he has said he would not pardon his son.
Hunter Biden was found guilty, and Joe Biden has very clearly said he would not pardon his son, he would not commute his sentence. How stark is this difference? I mean, how can Republicans keep making this argument now that Joe Biden has really put it out there?
He is not pardoning his son, which he could do. These are federal charges. Right. He is not doing that. He is not doing it because he is living what it means to have a rule of law in this country. Yeah. And then if you want to know if he believes it, you could actually see what is happening with his own son.
The contrast to how Trump has behaved, how Trump has treated the rule of law. This was a good day for the system, good day for sort of America as an example of how the rule of law should work.
He is the living, breathing embodiment of the rule of law in this country. He's made them all look a bit silly. Of course, lots of contrasts have been made with Trump's attitude to the judicial system. People were saying Trump would mess with the judicial system, Biden wouldn't. That now seems to be somewhat undermined. And this was the Democratic governor of Colorado, Jared Polis, speaking in response to the pardon. While as a father, I certainly understand Joe Biden's natural desire to help his son by pardoning him, I am disappointed that he put his family ahead of the country. This is a bad precedent that could be abused by later presidents and will sadly tarnish his reputation. When you become president, your role as paterfamilias of the nation. Hunter brought the legal trouble he faced on himself, and one can sympathize with his struggles while also acknowledging that no one is above the law. I'm not a president and not a president's son. No one is above the law, of course, is what Joe Biden said when Donald Trump was indicted on federal charges. Some Democrats were a little more sympathetic, though, to Joe Biden. This is what former presidential candidate Andrew Yang said. Joe Biden pardoning Hunter looks bad, but most fathers would do the same thing under the circumstances. I suppose not many fathers are the president, with a son going through the courts. My colleague Aaron Bassani said earlier today, if this had happened to him, his father would be saying, go after him even harder because I want to teach him a lesson. But that's not what Joe Biden is. That's not his fathering strategy, I suppose. As you'd imagine, though, it's the Republicans who've been making the most of Biden's U-turn. This was House Majority Leader Steve Scalise. You've been lied to every step of the way by this administration and the corrupt Biden family. This is just the latest in their long cover-up scheme. They never play by the same rules. They force on everyone else. Disgraceful. We'll give Hunter Biden the last word, though. Responding to his historic pardon, he said, I will never take the clemency I have been given today for granted and will devote the life I have rebuilt to helping those who are still sick and suffering. I assume that's sort of people with addiction issues. Ash, what's your take? Was this just Joe Biden being a good father?
Well, I was listening to what you said about Aaron, saying that his dad would say, go even harder on him. I want to teach him a lesson. I was just thinking, what would my biological father think in the same position? He'd probably be like, yeah, that's great. She can stop bugging me for 18 years of missed child support. So, different fathers react in different ways. I mean, I think in this case, you need to be able to separate two things. One is the way any loving parent would feel, particularly with regards to their last surviving son who has clearly struggled with addiction, right? Of course, there is a protective instinct. Of course, there is a desire to perhaps even insulate your child from the worst consequences of the things that they did when they were sick. I can completely understand that. But when you run for public office, particularly one as powerful as the president, you can no longer let your emotional ties to your family be the first priority. There is a higher priority that you are meant to serve. Now, of course, that comes into conflict with this idea of presidential pardons anyway. Presidential pardons give a huge amount of power to a president, particularly an outgoing president who doesn't want to stay in politics. I can understand their use, particularly in cases where you have people who have been wrongfully convicted. There was a Supreme Court judgment not that long ago regarding someone who was able to demonstrate his innocence for a murder that he was said to have committed, had been in prison for many decades. But the Supreme Court, their interpretation was that innocence is not enough to get you out of prison because you were given a fair trial. It kind of doesn't matter whether or not you're innocent because you had a fair trial in the first place. So that would be an instance where you'd go, yeah, presidential pardon, really good idea. Not for a son who, allegedly lied about his substance misuse in order to acquire a gun, which, if true, Michael, I actually think is quite a serious offense. I mean, obviously, the cultural attitude and the pervasiveness of guns is very different in the United States, where, you can get a gun as easily as you can get a packet of juicy fruit. But I think misrepresenting either your criminal history or your state of mind when buying something which is designed to kill people, I think is a pretty serious offence. And that's before you get to, I think, the more serious allegations which have dogged both Hunter Biden and his father regarding alleged corruption. In terms of Hunter Biden's role as a board member, I believe, perhaps even a director of an oil and gas firm called Burisma, which is based in Ukraine. This was something that Republicans and Donald Trump went very, very hard on. What they alleged was that Hunter Biden effectively sold access to his father when his father was vice president. later president, I believe. You'd have to just double check on that window of time for me. That there doesn't appear to be like you know, I guess a smoking gun, something where you can go, aha, incontrovertible piece of evidence. But what you did have was testimony offered by one of Hunter Biden's former business associates, where he said, well, what Hunter Biden did was sell the illusion of access. So while his father didn't speak on the phone directly with people with whom they wanted to do business, Hunter Biden would make a great show of putting his father on speakerphone, to sell the illusion of access. I'd say that's a pretty underhand and corrupt practice. Obviously, that's if you believe that President Biden never had a direct conversation with Hunter Biden's clients or prospective clients himself. So I think this is pretty gross. I also think that this is Joe Biden really in full like fuck it mode, because part of the reason why I imagine the White House and Democrat surrogates had been so uncaveated in their denial that Joe Biden would offer a pardon to Hunter Biden. Part of the reason why is because they were thinking about, okay, how's this going to play with voters, particularly when we're being accused of corruption, the Republicans are making hay of it. We're going to have to say that we believe in the law. Now, that should be a principle which survives even an electoral loss, where you don't need to win those people over anymore. And so, while it's obviously, you can't impact the result of an election that's already happened, it's exactly this kind of thing which makes people mistrust establishment politicians, and it creates the environment in which a populist candidate like Trump can thrive. And that's not because Trump is better or less corrupt or has a cleaner record. It's because the Democrats present themselves as one thing and then do the other. And I actually think people have a lower tolerance for those who profess virtue but can't live up to it, to people who are just out and out bastards all the time.
Why it's better to just admit you're an out and out bastard from the get go. Then no one can ever be annoyed at you. Or they can't be annoyed at you twice. They can only be annoyed at you for sort of the first thing, not the hypocrisy. We're going to come back to you on Gregg Wallace later, Ash. We joked beforehand that you're our wrong-uns correspondent for today's show. Case closed on Hunter Biden and Joe Biden. We'll see if you can take down Gregg Wallace with similar aplomb. Before that, though, let's move on to our next story. 2024 has been a year where incumbents get hammered. In the UK, France, Germany, and most recently the United States, national and state governments have been roundly rejected in the polls, a fact largely blamed on inflation. This weekend, though, Ireland appears to have bucked that trend. After their general election last Friday, the centrist coalition partners Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael finished with almost identical vote shares as they did in 2020. And the big losers were left-wing Sinn Féin, who finished down 6% compared to 4 years ago. They're in third place with 19% of the vote. Ireland has a proportional voting system using something called a single transferable vote, which means it takes a while to allocate actual seats after an election. But as it stands, they are distributed as following. So you've got Sinn Féin with 38, Fianna Fáil with 46, Fine Gael with 38, the Greens with 1, Labour with 11, the Social Democrats with 11, People Before Profit with 3, and Independents, well, there are 23 independents. That's not a party, of course. To find out more about the elections and what we should take away from the results, I spoke earlier to political commentator and comedian Tyg Hickey. And I started by asking him whether Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael's success shows the Irish electorate are relatively satisfied.
I suppose the answer is yes and no. So yes, in terms of the people who are doing all right in Ireland, we like to call them the I'm all right Jacks. Ireland has always been a country that's partitioned, not just geographically and politically, but in terms of the haves and the have-nots. So I feel like the haves have voted in numbers, because Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael would represent the establishment. They used to be rival parties. Now people have realised that in terms of ideology, there's nothing really to separate them at all. For the first time ever, Fianna Fáil voters are transferring to Fine Gael voters and vice versa. And that's new. So whatever kind of phony war they had before in terms of ideology and being two different entities, they've consolidated power by joining together. So we saw that in the last government. Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael effectively formed a government for the first time. That had never happened before. They brought in the Greens with them. So the kind of thing in Ireland, and I suppose it happens in Europe a lot, is to try and bring in some left-leaning party as your kind of mudguard. And that's what they did with the Greens. So the Green Party have been absolutely destroyed in this election. They have come up with one seat, and Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael have combined, and the voter who I suppose wants to see things continue as they are has come out in numbers. That voter would typically be in an affluent area. They would probably be a little bit older. It's something that we see in Britain, we've seen in the States. And sadly, the left is left floundering again. It didn't organise itself well enough. It didn't have a unified message. It didn't feel like there was a credible left alternative. And so it's the have-nots who will miss out. And sadly, it's largely younger people who unfortunately didn't vote in the numbers we would have liked to have seen, are now going to have to deal with another 5 years of a really conservative centre-right government that has proven it is either incapable or unwilling or both of solving the many crises we have in Ireland, and housing and health being, I suppose, numbers 1 and 2.
Let's in a moment move on to sort of the question of how the left sort of approached this election and sort of if that strategy paid off or not. I do want to focus just on, I suppose, again, the peculiarity maybe of this result. So I take what you're saying in terms of the fact that the government has been re-elected doesn't mean everyone's having a great time, right? It just means that there are enough people who felt that the economy or whatever was working well enough that they'd stick with the guys in power. But that is still fairly exceptional because, say, look at the United Kingdom, look at France, look at America. Everyone across the whole of society seemed to say, I don't like this economy. I'm doing terribly. The relatively well-off, the relatively poor. The fact was it seemed to sort of create these big majorities against incumbents, and that hasn't happened in Ireland. And so I'm wondering is there a sort of a section of people in Ireland who are maybe more insulated from sort of inflation and global economic problems than in other Western nations?
There definitely is. And as I say, the affluent areas, the more middle-class voter, they have definitely come out in numbers to make sure that the government parties are supported and they stay in power. So it's definitely a vote for about 40% of the people who voted for Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. They transferred either side, and that's definitely a vote for I'm doing all right, and I would like to keep the facts of my all rightness. That's certainly the case. But it is, I think, good to be aware that Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, after the Civil War in Ireland, used to be opposing sides. It's actually relatively new. It's very, very new that they've consolidated together to form this kind of centre-right coalition, and it's to keep Sinn Féin and the rise of Sinn Féin out. So you're right to assess that it's unusual, it's bucking trends, but in many ways, the fact that these parties used to be rivals and now decided to kind of collaborate to keep leftism out, that's a major factor that needs to be considered. I mean, one thing I am proud of, if you can notice in the tone of my voice, I'm obviously, in disarray after this election. I would have hoped for a better result. But one good thing that Ireland, and I think is bucking a trend on, is that the ultra-right parties that generally kind of have an anti-immigration policy, they have achieved no seat whatsoever. And I think that's unusual for Europe, that it's been a real, I think, voice from the people that wherever you are on the political spectrum, we're definitely not endorsing anything approaching a kind of a racist anti-immigrant message. And I think I am very, very proud to report that.
Yeah, that's interesting, actually, because I have sort of seen sort of increasing people talk about disquiet about immigration in Ireland. But yeah, it seems like there hasn't been a breakthrough for the far right here. Let's talk about Sinn Féin. I mean, if anyone had a disappointing result, presumably it was them. They came first 4 years ago. Now they've come third. They've dropped 6 points. What happened there? What went wrong for Sinn Féin?
Again, like it's a kind of result where it's a spin doctor's dream, because you can kind of spin it any way you want. I mean, it's the most seats Sinn Féin have ever won. So on that metric, it's a consolidation of the last election where they emerged as a major party to rival Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. You know, there are constituencies where they took more seats than they ever have before. You know, so it's not a disaster by any stretch of the imagination because it was a very poor run-in. This election kind of felt like it came very suddenly. It wasn't typically very kind of inspiring. Not a lot kind of happened. And Sinn Féin had come into it on the back of a number of controversies and scandals. And according to our media here, they were set to be wiped out. And that didn't happen. And I think that's largely in part to Mary Lou McDonald as a leader. She had like a really, really strong run-in and just kind of emerged as a nice person, as a good human being, which we don't really see from the centre-right parties. I might be a little bit biased there. But so relatively speaking, it wasn't a disaster. But I think what we definitely did see is some of Sinn Féin's vote going to other left parties that would be a little bit more kind of centre-left, that being the Social Democrats and Labour. They've both had very good campaigns. So it's not a disaster for Sinn Féin, but you're right to say that they haven't emerged with the mandate they did in 2020, which was a really exciting time. Had they run more candidates, it was likely that they would have been the major left party in government and we could have had a left alliance. I mean, for people who aren't that familiar with Ireland, Ireland has never had a left-leaning government. You know, so this is still quite a conservative society, and the vote for the establishment parties is kind of a vote for a lack of trust in what a left-leaning government would look like. I mean, would they start legalising cannabis? Would it be a bit like Portugal? You know, we're still a very kind of slightly timid conservative country in the post-colonial era. So I think, you know, Sinn Féin could have done with unifying a left message with some of the other parties to really show young people who are sick and tired of all the ills of society, to show, look, there is a left alternative. And I think even people on the left, like we've got a great party here who did very well, People for Profit, they were the only party to say, you know, without a shadow of a doubt, unequivocally, we are not going into government with either of the two big civil war parties. I think if the rest of the left had done that and there was a unified message, we might have seen something different. But yeah, look, the people who are going to be affected by more of the same didn't vote. And I think that's the tragedy. And it's how to get the message to those younger people that they need to get out and make their voice counted, or they're going to be the ones that face the repercussions of another 5 years of centre-right, you know, I'm all right, Jack-ism.
And let's talk about what comes next. I mean, you mentioned that after the last election, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael went into coalition with the Greens. The Greens have had a bad outcome. The two centre-right parties are going to need a coalition partner again because combined they don't make a majority. Who wants to take that role now? It seems to not necessarily work out in the long run for whichever party wants to sort of prop those two up.
Well, back in 2011, it was Labour who ended up being the mudguard and absolutely destroyed the reputation of the party. And now our perception of Labour in Ireland is a bit like your perception of Keir Starmer's Labour, which is not anything remotely approaching left values. They are in the position again where they can support Fianna Fáil. Those conversations are going on. Apparently, Ivana Bacik, who's the leader of Labour, has said that she doesn't want to go into government with Fianna Fáil on her own. So she's looking for a kind of a co-conspirator in being the mudguard. I think most people on the left would like to see Labour, the Social Democrats, not be that mudguard and just stay out of it, to force Fianna Fáil putting in government a couple of independents who are of their thinking. They'll probably make up the seats they need by a couple of independents. A lot of our independents as well are ex-Fianna Fáil or ex-Fine Gael, so they're not really independent at all. They've just left the party over a particular issue, but they will support the party ideologically. Personally, I would like to see that, because if there's no one on the left to be eviscerated by the next 5 years of things getting worse, at least it will be a kind of a clear perception for the electorate that we need to get these ruling parties out. And actually, it might give the left the 4 or 5 years it needs to finally coalesce and provide some sort of alternative for government, which I think particularly young people are just crying out for. So I think it's a little bit of an older generation and a younger generation, but I think it's more becoming a right and left type of divide in Ireland now, which again is actually kind of relatively new, because it used to be like Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, which is just kind of two versions of the same thing. So at least there's a left voting bloc. Now we need a left political party alliance to match that need that has been created, I think. And I'm hopeful, but I'm also terrified of the idea of another 5 years of the same.
If you're ever looking for a lesson in how not to do crisis comms, MasterChef's Gregg Wallace this weekend provided a masterclass.
Now, I've been doing MasterChef for 20 years. Amateur, celebrity and professional MasterChef. And I think in that time, I have worked with over 4,000 contestants of all different ages, all different backgrounds, all walks of life. And apparently now, I'm reading in the paper, there's been 13 complaints in that time. Now, in the newspaper, I can see the complaints coming from a handful of middle-class women of a certain age just from Celebrity MasterChef. This isn't right.
So Gregg Wallace's implicit attack on middle-class women of a certain age was in response to allegations that he has consistently made inappropriate comments on set of a sexual nature. The first public allegation was made last week by the BBC's Kirsty Walk, who starred on Celebrity MasterChef in 2011.
The first time that I suppose we were subjected to a kind of sexually inappropriate story was it was very early morning, and we were in a retirement home, and the crew was in a room with the contestants, Jonta Road, and we were getting ready. We'd each been given a recipe that one of the residents was a favourite baking recipe, and that we were going to do our best to bake for them, and then they were going to come to the kitchen and they were going to judge it. And Gregg Wallace came in and launched into a soliloquy, essentially a story of a sort of sexually inappropriate nature about his, well, now former wife. And I was really shocked. I thought, what is this about? You know, I was angry because I thought, this is just not on.
Other celebrities to have come forward about Wallace include radio host Asma Mir, who was allegedly asked by Wallace to pass a sexual and demeaning remark to a media executive of her acquaintance. Ulrika Johnson, who told The Telegraph that a fellow contestant on Celebrity MasterChef walked off set after Wallace told a rape joke. And Kirsty Allsop, who told Channel 4 that Wallace made inappropriate comments in front of her, and then went on to say this about Wallace's comments about middle-class women of a certain age.
For a start, I think the narrative is that it's women who are too sort of unsexy, too old to get his jokes. I think it's a narrative of oh no, you're speaking out because you just don't get it. You're too old. You're all dried up old hags. That's what I feel that he's saying. But I think that the reason, if it is true, and I don't think it's true, I think that a lot of women have come out who are not middle-class women of a certain age. That's what I've been given to understand. But if it were true, let's say, Kathy, it were true, those are the women with the power. Those are the women who should be speaking out.
Now, Kirsty Allsop seems to be correct when she says complaints aren't just coming from middle-aged women of a certain age. The Telegraph say they have spoken to 20 staff members on MasterChef who made allegations. The Telegraph write this. The Telegraph approached a former staff member who claims that she was asked to clean a stain off Wallace's trousers, at which point he mimicked a sex act. She says that in front of other production staff, he held the back of her head and thrust his body towards her. She was young at the time and found the incident distressing. The woman subsequently decided to make a formal complaint to the BBC about the alleged incident, which took place over a decade ago. The Telegraph has also spoken to one of the people who is said to have witnessed Wallace's behaviour and understands they have also spoken to the BBC. It was not the only allegedly lewd conduct detailed in the complaint that the BBC received from the woman. In her letter to the broadcaster, she also claimed that Wallace had walked into the MasterChef studio completely naked except for a sock pulled over his penis before doing a silly dance, an incident which she claimed left staff hugely unsettled and which she looks back on as incredibly inappropriate. She also alleged Wallace was very touchy-feely and made disgusting sex-related jokes. Ash, I mean, Gregg Wallace is very famous, fairly charismatic on MasterChef, so you can see why this is a big news story. What do you make of this? What do you make of this story?
Sorry, I'm still stuck on penis sock. Like, I'm still having an emotional reaction to that. This stuff is rife in the media, and even someone like me who, like, is fairly powerful in that I don't rely on any one, um, establishment media outlet for my income. I have a home here, it's Novara. Even I have to make decisions about how to um, manage the behavior of sexually inappropriate men because they've been with these organizations for a really long time, because they've got public facing presenting roles, and because I feel that the easier thing to do is to get rid of the person with no contract rather than the person on a staff contract. I mean, there's someone who fairly senior and powerful at a particular media corporation, where in the like height of summer, when it was like, approaching 40 degrees, this was a couple of years ago, just like would always make comments if I was wearing shorts, and it didn't matter how long my shorts were, would always refer to them as hot pants, and would get like kind of excited about it. And so now it's like, well, do I want to give up this job? Do I want to give up this platform to like advance, a set of politics that I believe in? No. So the call I made is that I'm just not gonna wear shorts in front of him ever again. And it feels gross to have to make that kind of compromise. So I I know that there'll be some people that say, well, intention really matters here. Like, he's setting out to make women uncomfortable. I think that the really important thing here is that if you don't have a relationship with somebody where you've got a sense of where their actual humor is, not just the laugh that they do to go along with you to not make things uncomfortable, where their humor actually is. I don't want in those kinds of scenarios to make everyone kind of just regurgitate HR when they're talking together. People make bawdy jokes, that's fine. But when it tips over into, I guess, the explicit, when and I guess it's like, think of it as like EQ levels, right? There's like explicitness, like the degree of like affection and familiarity that you already have, like how well do you know each other, who are the other people in the room, like all these things matter when you're taking into account whether something like this is beyond the pale or not. So that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing that I want to say is that, weirdly, I can also understand this from Gregg Wallace's point of view. And how I imagine it goes is this. By the way, not the middle class women of a certain age thing, because that's just finding a reason to blame women for being uncomfortable rather than looking at your own behavior. But where I can understand why he might feel quite wronged, and this is just my opinion, this is just speculation, is that he's probably gone through, decades of working with the BBC now, where he's like, well, everyone was always laughing at me. Like, everyone thought it was fine. And I kept getting this, contract renewed again and again and again. And I was their star, and they seemed to love me, right? They would, tell me how great the show is. And they seemed to love me, like when the cameras were rolling, when the cameras weren't rolling. Where's all this come from? I get that. Like, I get being like genuinely kind of confused by it. And the other thing, which I imagine is playing into this, and we saw this with Jermaine Genius, is that after the Hugh Edwards scandal, where a former BBC, kind of flagship host, was convicted of a criminal offence, in this case, possession of child sexual abuse imagery. The BBC's gone into full arse covering mode, so it's sort of doing this like, big like trawling of the net, and what's getting caught in it are men who have behaved inappropriately and behaved in ways which are wrong, but certainly haven't done the kind of thing that Hugh Edwards did or Jimmy Savile did, and probably feel a bit like, hang on, I'm being turned into a bit of a scapegoat here. And I can imagine feeling quite hard done by that. So I think you've got to like look at all of these issues a bit separately. Like, one is it right for Gregg Wallace to allegedly have behaved that way? If all these things are true, I'd say no, obviously not. The second thing to consider is, I can imagine that for Gregg Wallace, it's been, nothing has been said to him directly until now. Perhaps it could have gone that way. And then you've got this latter element, which is, you know, the BBC sort of trying to compensate for, you know, these two massive sexual it's not sexual harassment or sexual impropriety. We're talking about one of the most prolific child abusers in British history, and, you know, a very high profile newsreader convicted of possession of child sexual abuse imagery. These are really, really serious things. And it just feels like now what the BBC is catching in its net is like, well, not right. Doesn't approach that degree of seriousness, and certainly doesn't make up for the institutional failures when it came to the case of Jimmy Savile.
I want to get your thoughts on a couple more clips, Ash, because I don't think anyone is watching this thinking Gregg Wallace didn't do something wrong here. Gregg Wallace clearly did something wrong here. That is not the way you should behave in the workplace. I suppose what I want us to talk about is because I suppose we've had conversations recently about how sometimes sort of media discourse can sort of inflate the harm of words, and sort of things can sometimes feel like they've got a bit out of proportion. I'm not saying that's happened here, but I want to get your thoughts on these. I'll jump to it. So this first one I wanted to show because I think when stories like this come out, and one of the questions I always ask is, not ask, or I ponder, you know, is this man who's made these women feel uncomfortable doing it intentionally to make them feel uncomfortable? And I would say actually sort of commenting on your own sort of shorts, that's different as well. But if he's sort of making lewd comments about a third person in the presence of men and women, is he doing it specifically to make the women feel uncomfortable? And in this case, it's not... Well, let me show you the clip and let me get your response. So this is a London cabbie telling Nick Ferrari a story this morning.
Between 5 and 10 years ago, I picked him up, Gregg Wallace. I didn't watch the MasterChef programme that much, but I'd obviously seen him on
He's such a
telly.
distinctive-looking bloke, isn't he?
Yeah, that's right. So obviously I knew who he was. I picked up many celebrities, famous people in my time, so I knew who he was. And he got in the taxi and we're going on the journey. And within about a minute or so, he asked the driver, "Can I ask you a question?" And I said, "Well, yeah." And he said, "Are you married?" I said, "I am, still am. I am and was married." And he said, "Can I ask you what your sex life between you and your wife is like?" You know.
Oh my God.
And I said to him, "This is not the way to behave. Is this it? You know, this is long before all this came out."
And so, Ash, I didn't want to cut you off, you know, before you were going to disagree with me, but just I wanted to get that clip out there because I suppose the clip to me suggests, you know, if with these stories from these women, you could imagine that is he doing this sort of to try and humiliate the women in his presence? Is that his motivation? Or is he being sort of irresponsible by doing this? And I suppose the fact that he gets into a cab and just says it to the male cab driver, it sort of puts it more on a spectrum with like being a really weird guy as opposed to necessarily someone who sort of is out to humiliate women. I don't know. I want your response on this.
Well, I suppose the thing that I'm trying to say is that in some ways, like, intention isn't as important as impact in cases like this, because you are talking about not just a sort of social setting, right? You're talking about in the case of, you know, being on set for MasterChef or whatever else it is. These are workplace settings. So let me give you a different example, all right? As you well know, I am happily married, all right? So if I went to go visit my husband's office and he introduced me to, you know, his colleagues, and then as I left, you know, he turned to his colleagues, which included female colleagues, and went, "Oh, well, doesn't Ash have lovely tits? Don't you think she's just got wonderful tits? I just want to go, oh, I just want to like motorboat them all the time." Right? Like, one is I really hope that he does think I have lovely breasts. That's, you know, I want him to think that. I don't want him to say that to his colleagues, not just for my behalf, but his colleagues' behalf. It doesn't matter that it's a third party. It's something which, like, particularly for women, but I also think that this can be the case for men as well. I mean, you know, just thinking about the ways in which Terry Crews, who's an American actor and comedian, has been, you know, sexually assaulted and sexually harassed by other men who treat him as this sort of like big muscular sex object in a way which has been really awful. So not just women, but particularly women. You know, just because you're commenting on a third party and, you know, your intention isn't to make someone else uncomfortable, but you're just sort of you're letting your intrusive thoughts win. I think that doesn't matter so much when you're in a workplace context. I mean, if we were hanging out in the studio, as we are often want to do, and Gary, who I know is producing the show tonight, was like, I've just seen some absolutely banging porn. Look, it doesn't matter that it's a third party, right? It doesn't matter. So I think that there is a bit too much being made of intention here. Sure, he might be a really, really weird guy who always lets his intrusive thoughts win, regardless of whether it's men or whether that's women. I buy that. But like when you're talking about, is this thing sexist? You are considering intention, but you're also considering impact. And I think that this is something which has a sexist impact.
Yeah. No, I think that's all correct and uncontroversial. I've got one more clip for you before I let you go. This is Rupa Huq, who's a Labour MP. I think she's on the media sort of select committee. This is her speaking on Radio 4 this morning.
There is an argument for pausing while this investigation takes its course and maybe not airing it tonight. I mean, it could be massively triggering for the women involved. In fact, any woman involved in any type of similar incident. So I think out of sensitivity, because otherwise, I mean, I know you're saying that he's stopped presenting, but to the casual viewer, there's not going to be any difference if it's on TV tonight. It looks like sort of he got away with it.
Ash, I want your thoughts on this. I will clarify. I agree with absolutely everything you've said this evening. I think what he's done is completely wrong. I do think, regardless of intention, it has a disparate impact on women, which means it is a sexist thing to do in the workplace. When I heard that by Rupa Huq, I was feeling a bit, are we going overboard here? The guy has stood down from his, do we really need to sort of disappear future episodes of MasterChef, which we've already been filmed, lest we trigger someone because this man told lewd jokes in a workplace? I mean, what do you take? What's your take on this? Sorry.
I mean, look, unless there's more to come out, and there might be, I would say probably not. I think disciplining him, sacking him, is probably enough. And I think that this is, not all of these things are the same. All right. So hearing a lewd joke versus, someone coming in naked apart from, a sock on their penis versus, somebody grabbing your head and, I guess from the context, thrusting their crotch towards it. These are all different things. All right. So one can make me feel very uncomfortable and, maybe humiliated and sort of like disrespected as a woman in the workplace. And that's bad. The second thing might be that plus a bit more. You might just be like, I don't feel safe around this guy. Like he just seems like really volatile and sexually inappropriate. That makes me feel not safe to be in like confined spaces with him. Because what if he does this while we're alone? To something which is, genuinely, again, I don't want to put words in the mouth of someone else, right? Like it's up to them to talk about how they experience that. But I think that some people would say that's a form of sexual assault, really. Like I can imagine someone saying that, and it wouldn't be unreasonable to say that. So the levels of trauma involved, if all these things are true, they're different, right? They're different. So I think that items 1 and 2, maybe like you don't have to worry about like re-traumatizing somebody. Item 3, maybe you do, but I'm not sure. I've not read anyway in any of the accounts of what's happened. I've not read anyone talking about that within the context of being traumatized. So I don't know. I think, sacking him from MasterChef is enough. Right, we don't have to go the full Stalin and erase him from the photographs, because also there's a lot of men that look like him. Like, what if Harry Hill gets caught up in it? That would be.
I would hate for Harry Hill to get caught up in this. That would be really tragic. Although it could any of your favorite TV stars could be a creep when the cameras go off. You never know, do you, Ash?
You never know. That's why I've got a list, and I've got a list which I've distributed to my best friend, my husband, and also my housemate, of a list of people where I don't want to hear anything bad about them, right? Like if their name is in the news, you protect me from that, because we need heroes. We need heroes. So if Kendrick Lamar does anything bad, I don't want to know.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure I'm on that list. And we should get, I think Gary's got to close some tabs before Novara Media HR comes in the studio. It's been a pleasure. Was that an inappropriate joke in the workplace? I don't know.
I don't know.
You tell me.
You're going to have to,
You're the expert on this, apparently.
You're going to have to wait until Gary lodges a complaint with you.
Well, the header video laughed, so if it was inappropriate, I'm saying it was a lack of leadership. Thank you, everyone, for watching tonight. Ash, it's been a pleasure being joined by you.
All right. Bye-bye. And like I said, just remember, anything bad about Kendrick Lamar, I don't want to know.
Perfect. Let's wrap up there. We'll be back tomorrow from 6 p.m. You've been watching Novara Media. Good night.